quite a few people in here, so I'll just go ahead and get started. Feel free to keep telling us what you're watching. Introduce yourself. My name is Joshua Driver. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Selflessly, and one of the homies that's helping out on the virtual Giveback program here. And so we're delighted to have you. If you're just learning about us or joining, just a quick background. Virtual Giveback is a group of us from Hedges, Serve Indiana, and Selflessly that got together when some of these pandemic issues were starting to rise up, and we wanted to figure out some ways that we could get in touch with organizations and provide resources and help in whatever we can to you guys. And so based on the feedback through our survey, there was a lot of interest in talking about how to respond to this through your volunteer engagement and what some options are, and open up that discussion. And so I'm delighted to have our virtual Giveback partner, Marc from Serve Indiana, with us. And then even I wouldn't say more excited, but just as super excited to have Cindy from Child Advocates here. And so our agenda today is really to take this time and focus on our experts here and talk about what to consider, what's going on, and how to think about it, and then listen to Cindy to give us, what they're doing with their organization and implementation strategies that hopefully you can take back to your organization as well. Again, if you're just joining us, please feel free to ask questions through the Q&A in the chat window. I'm going to be moderating those. We'll reserve some time here at the end for Q&A and anything else. So we'll get started here. And so I will share my screen, obviously, so that you can show your presentation, Marc. And let you go from here.
Great.
Go.
While Josh is putting that, we have a nice, really top shelf deck of slides for you all, and we are navigating just a few technology hang-ups. We started, so we, as you may or may not know, I am broadcasting live from my home living room, which has become my office for the past month. And today, my kids, I have two kids that are both in elementary and junior high school, and they started e-learning, and I didn't really anticipate this until now, but there will be because they're on e-learning, our Wi-Fi bandwidth has been significantly diminished. So I am on my phone, and Josh is using a slide deck from his computer. We're making it work. So I will be sharing with you all information that's driven by this slide deck, and Josh will be driving the slide deck, which is appropriate for his name. So thanks so much, Joshua. And this slide deck, we can make it available afterwards. I do also believe this call is being recorded, and we will share the call later for folks if you want to refer back to it or share it with colleagues who weren't able to join us in person today. So again, thank you so much. Welcome to the virtual Giveback call. It's great to be with everyone. I'm Marc Mcaleavey, the Executive Director of Serve Indiana. We have a few webinar kind of housekeeping items before we move forward. If you could advance to the next slide. Some of these might not be relevant, but just in case there's any feedback or tech snafus, if you wouldn't mind muting your phone or your computer to make sure that there isn't any feedback. We should have everyone muted but just in case there's any issues. And also, if you wouldn't mind, you can hold your questions until the end. We'll give you this information, and we'll have time, should have ample time at the end of our hour today to take any questions you have and have a conversation. We will use the chat feature for that, and I'll let you know when we get to that point in the call. And so feel free to just grab a cup of coffee or some water and sit back and relax, and we'll go through this really, I think, helpful information about volunteering during the COVID-19 era, which I will refer to often throughout our time today. So I just want to kind of share with you, if you could go to the next slide, please, Josh, a brief statement of our partnership. We have joined forces together, and it really is a very loose and organic partnership that started with a conversation between Josh and Zach at Selflessly, folks at my team at Serve Indiana, and Aaron Hedges, as we started a few weeks ago, 3 or 4 weeks ago, talking about just some of the things that we were seeing in our communities and the ways that we felt like, we knew our organizations were going to be impacted in a negative way, that this time in our history is going to present some significant challenges, has already started to present some significant challenges. And we also know that everyone has something to bring to the table. And so we wanted to figure out the best way that we could, align our resources and listen to everyone to figure out how we can support each other moving forward in this time of COVID-19. Hopefully a temporary time, but a very real and challenging time nonetheless. So that is, we came together to have a better understanding of what everyone's facing in the nonprofit sector, in the volunteer sector, in the civic sector, and then figure out what kinds of resources we can align and connect to support everyone in the communities and individuals that we're serving in Indiana. So that is the essence of our partnership, and it's been a really humbling and meaningful kind of ride as we've connected over the past couple of weeks to piece together different resources and kind of build community from this really kind of devastating place. So I will say that what I've noticed as we've listened to you all and had conversations and reviewed assessments, that in the midst of tragedy, in the midst of all of this really, really challenging times, there's just so much abundance. And I see that in your work, and I see that in your leadership. It's really not that there's, it's really helped me get through things. And I hope you've seen that too in your life and in your working lives as well. Like, there's just so many really wonderful leaders that we're engaged with in this work that are doing amazing things to support each other and to support the families and communities and individuals across the state. So I just want to take a minute to give you all some props and some kudos for everything that you're doing. It means a lot to us and is really the basis for our partnership and our work together. So we're, one of the things that we heard as we've listened to everyone and as we've assessed the nonprofit landscape is that, volunteering right now is in a real state of transition. The criteria, the conditions that we are meeting in our communities because of the special circumstances that have resulted from this really nasty virus has made us rethink the way that we are engaging citizens as volunteers in our communities. And that is the big theme that is pervasive across our time today. The big theme about volunteering under COVID-19 is that we are navigating volunteerism and community engagement in a time of significant transition. I know that you all probably can, you're the choir here, that you're the experts really, and maybe you can really, reinforce this notion, but everything is different, and we all are figuring out how we're moving forward in a rapid pace. Not to pull too often from a kind of trite analogy, but in many ways, volunteerism during the COVID-19 era is a lot like building the airplane as we fly it. And so I feel that every day in my work, and I'm sure that maybe some of you feel that as well. But what we do have, I think, are some really great leaders on the ground, i.e. you all, that are doing really great work to support our communities. We have also some really great evidence and some really great scientists and experts, not just in Indiana, not just in the United States, but around the world, who are thinking about volunteerism, health, safety, and the overall public health of our communities. So we're here to not pretend to be the overwhelming experts of this work, but to try to do a good job of giving you all the evidence that we've seen, the best practices that we've equipped ourselves with, but also to give you some empowerment and to give you some confidence in some ways, to say what you're doing is great, and we support you in that, and we support you in really thinking differently about volunteerism. And hopefully when we finish our call today, when we finish our time together, you'll walk away from this conversation feeling confident and empowered in engaging the volunteers in your communities moving forward. And also that we are part of a large community, and hopefully as you look at the folks who are chiming in on the chat feature, that you're seeing some colleagues or some friends that you are like, oh, I should connect with that person after the call and see how they're doing, and that we're also building community along the way. So that is the essence moving forward. In some ways, we are hoping to bring some information to you all, but in many ways, I feel like a lot of the things that we're going to present to you are very common sense, reflections on how to navigate volunteerism in the challenging and transitioning era. So I'll just wanted to kind of lay that out there before we move forward. We're going to highlight two different types of volunteerism. One is in-person volunteering, and one is virtual volunteering. As we move into in-person volunteering, I wanted to share with you all an article that I thought just did a really great job of highlighting the transitions that we're facing in the volunteer sector. NPR did this great article entitled "Coronavirus Drives Away Volunteers Just as They're Needed Most." And what's interesting about this article, it was a national article, but they highlighted a Hoosier organization, Hoosier Hills Food Bank in Bloomington, where they talked about the ways that they're transitioning their volunteer efforts. And I thought this was a really interesting statistic that probably resonates with you all. Katie Fitzgerald from Feeding America noted that the demand for their services is up 60%. So across the country, 60% increase in demand for food delivery, food assistance services. And at the same time, there's been a 60% drop in the number of volunteers available to help with those services. I think that's really telling of the transition and challenge that we're all facing in this work. A lot of those, my understanding of the food-based, food pantry, food security system is that so many folks who are involved with that work are aging or over the age of 55. And so many of them have been rightfully so asked to or volunteered to go to volunteer from home or not be in community to protect their safety and security during this time. So they've lost a lot of volunteer base, and I'm sure that's maybe the case for many of you all. So we're thinking about doing more volunteering with maybe less of a volunteer base. And that's very challenging. This article also notes the opportunity to think through virtual volunteer opportunities for our volunteers. And I know that virtual volunteerism is really powerful in this time, but it's also for some of us, not the only, isn't a great option, right? When you have to be in person, putting food into trunks, in person, helping, pharmacists give medication to individuals, whatever the scenario is, it's really hard to eliminate every opportunity for in-person volunteering. And this article, I think, did a really great job of highlighting the dimensions. So feel free to reference that article after the call. If you do I think we linked to it, but if you do a quick Google search by the title there, it'll be the first pop that you'll see, and it's a great read. So the need for in-person volunteering is real and still exists. We highly encourage folks to avoid it if they can. So we're not necessarily saying we want people to boldly pursue in-person volunteering options. We think it's risky, but oftentimes there are many examples where the risk is we have to face that risk. The opportunity for in-person volunteering for some of us is unavoidable. So let's talk through a little bit about what ways that we can think through in-person volunteering to make it safe and secure. If you could advance to the next slide. Thank you, Josh, very much. So we're not going to go into depth about volunteer engagement and recruitment strategies. That in and of itself is another call, and I feel like most folks on the call today are experts in volunteer recruitment and engagement strategies. I just wanted to note that now, under this very transitioning time of COVID-19, it is more important than ever to clearly state the need for the volunteer at your organization. My sense is, having had conversations with folks that are leading volunteer efforts, that they are looking for a direct impact if they are going to volunteer in person. They want to make sure that it's very necessary for them to be there in person. It's very important for them to see, before they sign up, the real need for them to be involved in in-person volunteerism. So I just ask, just to kind of like red flag this, like when you're thinking about engaging, recruiting volunteers that have to be in person, make sure that you look at how you're talking about the need for that volunteer. Also, make sure you're thinking through the steps your organization has taken to ensure the safety and well-being of those volunteers and the people that they're serving. I think it's important too, like when you're talking about recruiting volunteers during this time that have to be in person, that you document and show to them how you are supporting their health and their well-being and keeping them safe while they're volunteering in person. I think that's just an important thing to keep on your radar moving forward. So next slide, please. As we talk more about some of the best practices, I think many of you probably can anticipate some of those practices. They're things that are in our faces every day in the news, in our conversations, so they're very common sense. But also, there isn't really one size fits all, model for making sure that your volunteers are safe when they are volunteering in person. And that's because the dynamic nature of this virus and the dynamic nature of the potential in-person volunteer opportunities that you have at your organizations. We have designed a few best practices, and just note that there isn't a one size fits all, and I just ask that you take these best practices and modify them as needed for your organizations and the communities and individuals that you're serving. It's important, we feel like now more than ever, to make sure that your volunteers have a real orientation to their volunteer opportunities. When you get them in as volunteers, or even if you have a cadre of volunteers that have been volunteering for your organizations for a long time, it's a good time to reorient them or provide them an orientation about their volunteer efforts and also about COVID-19. It's important to just kind of put that out front and ahead of them so that they know what signs and symptoms to look for the virus, and that they know what their volunteer roles will be and how those interface. It's also, I want to just note, if you can make all of your orientations and trainings for your volunteers and your staff virtual, if you can. I know that there are probably some elements of training for volunteers that have to be in person, like for instance, and I'm probably going to pull on the food security sector as it's a great, I feel like it's a great sector to kind of pick on because it's so easy to see some of these concepts play out. But if maybe there's your training mostly can be virtual, but you need your volunteers to be on the ground and train some of them in person on some of the specifics of like where food is at a pantry and how to get the food into cars or into the homes of people who need it the best. So maybe there's a portion of the training that you used to deliver in person that you can now make virtual, but there's a portion that you still keep in person because it's out of necessity. It's important to tell your staff and your volunteers what to do if they start to feel ill. I think it's important to build a culture that in your volunteer base that recognizes that it's okay to share if you feel ill, especially now more than ever. I think one of the challenges that we face is the fear of being diagnosed with COVID-19 or having COVID-19 might drive people away from saying, hey, I don't feel so well right now, right? Because there's kind of a fear factor. But if there's a way that you can build a culture where it's okay to identify feelings of sickness or illness and show a very concrete way to articulate that. So if tell your volunteers, if you feel sick, these are the staff, tell these staff people that you're sick, or make sure you notify your volunteer supervisor immediately, give them real direct advice on how to talk about if they're feeling ill or sick, and reinforce the policy that it's not about punishment. If you're a volunteer and you are feeling sick or ill, nobody wants you to serve primarily because we want you to feel better. Even if it's not COVID-19, if you're not feeling well, take some time off, go home, relax, and contact the doctor or a healthcare professional immediately for follow-up. We all talk about social distancing. It's more important than ever before in volunteerism. I know some volunteers are really gregarious, kind of extroverts like myself, and it's hard sometimes to be around other people and not want to, high five or hug or handshake. But it's critical, as you know, to stress social distancing. Think through the logistics of your volunteer efforts so that your volunteers know how to social distance and conduct their volunteer efforts in a way that isn't putting them into direct contact with other humans as much as possible. If you have there's new evidence every day about the use of hand gloves and of masks. I recommend just using them. If you have homemade masks that your volunteers can use while volunteering in person, have them use it. I mean, it's the evidence isn't overwhelming about the impact of it, but it's enough to suggest that if you're practicing social distancing and you are, washing your hands and practicing good personal hygiene, that a mask only helps, right? It may not entirely prevent the passing of the virus, but it will help. So I recommend, as much as possible, the use of homemade masks and gloves if they're available. I wouldn't go out of your way to, if you have like kitchen gloves or whatnot, but still neither of them substitute the need for social distancing, and neither of them substitute the need for routine hand washing and those sorts of things. We have found it important to set a temperature-based no entry rule. So either that's a self-identify, which is not ideal. But if you just set the example that you cannot volunteer if you have a fever above 100 degrees, or what's even better is if you have a checkpoint. So every time a volunteer comes to volunteer, have a like a no-touch thermometer that you can use. I don't know how available they are. Sometimes you can get them shipped to you on a pharmacy, like a CVS.com or a Target.com. You might have some challenges in accessing some of those thermometers. But if you can, I recommend having one and having someone on your staff or a volunteer, just take temperatures as they begin their volunteer shift. And lastly, and I reinforce this throughout the time, require proper hygienic behaviors. Monitor. It's good to set up a policy or practice where you have a volunteer manager or volunteer shift supervisor, if you will, who's constantly reminding and requiring your volunteers to take a break every 20 minutes or so, wash their hands, put on some lotion, and go back at it. It's just a good practice to be in. If I find that if you don't constantly remind or require folks to do it, it's easy to put off. So we find every maybe 20 minutes, every 30 minutes, have folks take a 30-second break to wash their hands and come back. Folks' hands will be dry, but it's better to have dry hands that are cracked than to have or pass on the coronavirus, is my take. Next slide, please. So what do you do if you do all these things and you have someone who is confirmed that you know of, that's been a part of your organization or part of your facility or your operation that's been confirmed with COVID-19? First, I just want to say, do everything you can to make sure you're compliant with HIPAA laws. But second, if you know this happens, always contact your local health officials and assess your risk, right? So once you know that person is quarantined and not maybe passing the virus on to others, the first thing you should do is contact your local health officials and let them know that you are aware that someone who tested positive for COVID-19 has been involved with the operations. The second thing you should do after contacting them is pursue like a plan B, right? So, and this is something that I think I just encourage everyone to think through now, which is the question, what would happen if someone on your staff or someone involved with your in-person volunteer efforts tested positive for COVID-19? Because there are steps you will probably need to take to clean and disinfect your operations, your facility, whatever context your in-person volunteers are serving in. So what are you going to do when you're in that process of disinfecting and kind of cleaning up after the potential spread of COVID-19 at your shop or your facility? How are you going to ensure that you're still delivering services? Do you need to take a break? If you take a break in your services, how will that work? I think it's good to have those conversations now before someone's been tested positive, so that when that happens, you can, as best as you can, try to deliver your services in an uninterrupted way. This slide also has information about what to do if there's different degrees of community spread. I'm not going to go into detail today, but just know that that's there and it will be available to you. It's information we got from the CDC. It'll be available to you after the call if you need that more detailed information. So those are some of the real, kind of high level, but also best practices that we wanted you to think through when engaging volunteers, if you need to, in an in-person way. And just some key takeaways there are, try to reduce human-to-human contact. make sure that folks are routinely practicing good hygiene, washing hands on a routine basis, and make sure that you have a plan B if you find out that someone that you're working with or volunteering with has been tested positive for COVID-19, and build a culture of health and wellness and transparency around that as much as you can. It's definitely possible. If you have to have in-person volunteers, there's ways to do it so that we're minimizing the risk and mitigating any kind of damage created as a result. Next slide, please. We're moving on to virtual volunteering, and this is another transition. I think virtual volunteering wasn't much of a concept 2 months ago, right? It was spotty at best, but now virtual volunteering is probably the way to go if you can shift to a virtual model. I'm going to give a few highlights here, and then we'll move on to some real great expert kind of testimony on how to make this happen. One great way, just make sure that you're identifying volunteer jobs that can be performed at home. If you have an intake center where people usually come in and give information, see if there's a way that you can set up a 1-800 number so that people can call in. Technology is challenging because in some of the communities that we serve, there is access to technology, but a lot of those access points have been closed. Libraries are closed, schools are closed, and those are sometimes the way that our population, the populations that we work with, access technology. So I would think through other ways like, telephone, mail-in data so that folks are still connecting with you, but in a way that's social distancing and virtual. Set up flexible work hours so that if you have an in-person, like if you have a call center, for instance, that you have to have someone at the center volunteering, that there's only one person there. There's time for that person to, clean and disinfect for the next shift, and make sure that that's staggered and flexible, and determine what level of staff and volunteer absenteeism will disrupt your service. So at what point, what's the bare minimum of volunteer engagement and staff engagement that you need to make sure that your services stay, at the dosage needed to support your communities, individuals, and families. Those are the high level kind of points that I wanted to illustrate. I would say, having access to things like Wi-Fi, telephones, cell phones. If there's a way, like Slack is a great platform that's free that you can use to kind of like share tasks in a virtual space so that you can connect teams of volunteers together and share documents and whatnot. There's all, just shift to slack.com. Josh shared with everyone is one recommendation. I know there's many others, but just do what you can to make your virtual teams work in a virtual space well. With that said, I'm gonna hand it off to a real strong leader in our communities, Cindy Booth, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Child Advocates. They've done some really great work, and I will send it off to her right now. Cindy?
Thank you, Mark, and thanks, Josh and Aaron, for connecting me with everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to tell about Child Advocates and our journey. I approach this like a case study. Just if there are things that we have done that motivate you or get you to brainstorm on what you can do, I'm hopeful that that happens. And as many of you that joined us, I know our CASA programs, and you know what CASA is, but let me tell you, the rest of you, what CASA is. So Child Advocates is the CASA, Court-Appointed Special Advocate Program in Marion County. And what we do is we represent the best interest of children in the child welfare system. And so our volunteers have a very specific duty about going out and visiting children. So that's not happening right now. We're doing it in a different way. And so pre-COVID, I'm going to tell you, pre-COVID, how we trained volunteers was always in person. and we are required to provide 30 hours of training to our volunteers. And years ago, we did it in the same way, on the same nights of the week, at the same time. We didn't change anything. And I think probably someone smarter than I, said, you know, maybe if we did some training during lunchtime, we could get different volunteers. So we started changing up like that. And we began to divide the required 30 hours of training several years ago into some things that we could do, sort of dipping our toe into the virtual piece, right? We would have a video that we would show, and we would have an information session that might have a video of me welcoming the volunteers, that kind of thing. But what the experience with COVID has done is really pushed us to think, how must we change our business? And so I'm going to talk about 3 ways that we have incorporated virtuality into what we do with volunteers. Our pipeline, how we get them, how they move through the pipeline, the actual training class, and then the mission that we do. So your mission is different, and you might think that wouldn't work for us, that would work for us. But I have found benchmarking to be very beneficial no matter who I talk to. So just sort of listen to how we've done things and see if that can help you. So, so first off, with our pipeline, we always study our pipeline of our volunteers from that interest, you know, that advertisement, whatever it is, all the way to getting them in the seats to volunteer, and you know, to be in the class, and then out in the world volunteering for our children. And we look at where do we receive the most interest in our ad activities and that kind of outreach. And we look at who drops out from that first engagement, who doesn't come to the, you know, the application, who doesn't come into the class, who doesn't graduate, how do we lose them to be a volunteer? And so if any part of that pipeline is disrupted, then our volunteer pool helping children and supporting our mission suffers. So COVID has brought 2 major disruptions to our pipeline. First, that first interaction, which we used to do, and many not-for-profits do, in an info session in person, where they get to meet some of your staff, they see your building, you know, it's sort of drawing them in. So that was disrupted. And then the actual training. So we cannot have people in our building. And I'll talk about a little later on how we're having to adapt what our volunteers actually do with children right now. So unlike maybe the food pantry idea where volunteers are still needed, our volunteers, at least in Marion County, in the child welfare system, the court has closed only to emergency motions and initial hearings. So we're not interacting with children in any way except virtually right now. So first off, in the online info session of our pipeline, the very first part of seeing our volunteers, as I said, the info sessions were held at our office in the morning and the afternoon, and they interacted with members of our staff. They were roughly an hour, and participants had to register. And so it wasn't an open cattle call, come and volunteer at Child Advocates. So there was a video of me and our chief program officer greeting the volunteers, giving information on the work. The staff member would interact with the people there. The effort, you know, to sort of screen out people as you're doing the work, but also pushing them along the pipeline if they're appropriate. So all of those things we realized could happen virtually. And so, so we have just tried our first online sessions of the info sessions. Now, I'll tell you the back part of this is we had to create a Zoom account and invite, you know, you have to invite the participants in. So I imagine, you mentioned, Mark, something about older volunteers. Well, also older volunteers may need some help with that technology. So you have to kind of think of that. And then recently you've heard about Zoom bombing and security issues. So you want to make sure you understand that. And so one of the things that I appreciate about our volunteer program director is doing trial runs before people are actually involved. And so I think he did several of those. And I think my responsibility as CEO is making sure that people are following the security measures on Zoom that are recommended. So I'm not a tech person, but I can pass that on to people and say, please, you know, make sure that you're doing that. Helping people who need help, who might be older or who don't understand technology. And I think what we were doing before the session on the online, and I'll let you know how that goes, that info session, can still be held virtually. People can do, as we've all learned here in the last month, right? We can get lots of information and figure out what we're doing by seeing people and interacting in the chat room. One thing that I'll mention too, that one of our people went to online classes with another CASA program in another state to see how they were doing. And I recommend that as well, to find out what your colleagues in your area are doing. So that really translates well on what your mission is. He noted, he said, that chat room gets really personal. I don't know what it is about, you know, the virtuality of this, is that we have a chat room and you might ask a question or bring up a topic you normally wouldn't if you were sitting in class with other people. So you want to think about how you're going to handle that. But then, so I will let you know how it worked. I think we're really excited about doing that. I think we will probably do many of those info sessions virtually moving forward. It makes sense, right? We were doing the old way before. Certainly we'll do the old way in some ways forever, but I think adding this is just another way we can bring other people into the organization, and we all need to do that for all the volunteers that we have. So the online class, so we're starting 2 online classes, and as I said, our hours of training are required by our Indiana Supreme Court. So in your mission, in your agency, it might not be that way, but we have to provide certain things, certain topics, you know, the legal structure of child abuse laws, what they will be doing in court, what the court structure is. So very specific things. Some of those things we had already figured out, as I said earlier, that we could do in 15 of that 30 hours, we could do that online. So we combined homework, what we call homework sessions, or we would do some things with mentoring with other advocates on our staff, court observations. So there were things that we were already doing and combining online work. So what our volunteer program director did is he joined an online class of a CASA program that had started online classes a couple of months ago. So he participated as a participant and was able to see how it worked and some of the things that he brought back. And I think for all of us who are going to be training virtually, this is a really good idea. And we've modeled it here today to have a host of the training session who can monitor what's going on, and then having someone who is monitoring that chat room to figure out, particularly as we're training our volunteers in the substantive work, what questions are valuable, what questions can be answered, you know, is that person kind of veering off this way, you know, sort of monitoring what people are thinking in the chat room. So I thought that was a really good idea. Things I think as you change, I think you need to think about what you are concerned about. So here's me, I've been at Child Advocates for a long time. I always understood, and maybe those of you out there also understand this, when you're screening volunteers to participate with your organization, that in-person gut feeling that you have about a person as they're going through the training, as they're reacting to what's being said, how do you substitute that with, or how do you make sure you're doing that as you're going through the online training in the class? And so what we saw was that we thought we need to do a real follow-up with people who apply to do a one-on-one interview, whether it's virtual or not, but to have a very, for our purposes, because they're visiting children, right? We still do all our criminal history checks, the sex abuse registry, all that. But that one-on-one piece, that one-on-one interviewing is really important. Now that can be done virtually, or it could be done in person once we're past all this. So I think that was something that I was really worried about. How are we going to know this person, you know, as we're screening through the class? And my fears were allayed with that. Also the in-class monitoring that can happen if you have that two-trainer model, I think is really important. Also, you know, we have some folks, and I'll say I'm the first one, unfamiliar with some Zoom techniques, right? I had to ask some advice before we started on how do I do this? And I think practice that so that your agency is really able to handle all those things. That's a technical thing, but I think if you can project that air of confidence, then those people that are volunteering who may not be, and again, as you said earlier, many of our volunteers are older, how can you help them access the technology that they need to? The last thing I say, and this is more of an administrative thing, what I realized when we talked about moving to more virtual practices with volunteers, whether it's the info session or the actual training, you might think that it's going to be less expensive or needs less resources, but sometimes you have to think about what resources you need. So we didn't have a Zoom account. We needed to have a Zoom account for the agency. We may need some other technological devices. We may need now maybe 2 trainers in each session. So those are things that I think you need to think about as you go through. How are we changing from the old way that we're doing it to the new way post COVID-19? Let's see. So we did practice runs. So our volunteer, I did say that our volunteer director did do practice runs. He's gone to other classes so that he can make sure that he's comfortable all that. And making sure that, oh, the other thing that we did was we changed our 3-hour in-person class to 2 hours. And we're going to watch this because we think, okay, you can do a 3-hour class in person. You have breaks. You can chat with people as they're coming in and out. But sitting for 3 hours for a training virtually, maybe that will work or won't work. So we're trying 2 hours and see what we think about that. So as you're looking through how you're going to use virtual techniques to bring volunteers in and train, you also want to think about what changes are we going to have to do to our practice. Also, I think it's important to change or to at least consider the message you're giving at each one of those parts of the pipeline, the message you're giving to the volunteers. So they're ready for what's happening. So they know, not only the message that, okay, we're all here in COVID-19 and we're not quite sure when it's going to end, but you can help us. We need your help now. That message, that message that you're giving to people out there, what you can do to help them support your mission now. But then also the message about what their training will be like. And the assurance that you will be at the end, you'll be a trained volunteer, and here's how it's going to happen in this virtual way. I think that's really important to do as you go through. So the way CASA works is we have, at least at Marion County, volunteers who come in and train are then assigned to a staff supervisor. And the way that we have always worked is that supervisor has communicated with their volunteer through emails, texts, and all those things. So that has translated very well. That's a good transition for us pre this virus and now. Also, CASAs across the state have an online database. So all of the work that the volunteers do in our mission is put in an online database. So they're used to that piece of technology as well. So that, I think, helps us transition into what I'll call volunteering virtually, although that makes me think that like volunteers aren't real. So volunteering in a virtual world. So we currently don't use volunteers for administrative tasks or other tasks other than going out and seeing children. And so as I said earlier, what has happened, I think pretty much across the state, is that many courts are closed except for emergency hearings. So what our practice has been in our mission is that our responsibility is to go out and monitor children in relative care, foster care, placement facilities. That can't happen in person. So we as a staff and existing volunteers have had to embrace doing all of that virtually by Zoom, by FaceTime, texts, emails, phone calls. So those are the ways that we're already changing our volunteers' practices, and they know our staff is doing the same thing. So that's how we've had to work through that. So our volunteers are monitoring children, but not face-to-face. And I've told you all the ways that they're doing that. So 2 important things back to the message idea. So our supervisors of the volunteers have been instructed to continually to reach out to our existing volunteers. So there's a responsibility that we have to our existing volunteers if you're moving to virtuality. And I know that that's really important to do, to make sure they're in the loop of what our agency is doing and what their responsibility will be in this virtual way, and giving them ideas on how to do it and supporting them as they change over to not seeing children in person, which is a really important part of why they volunteered for children, to saying it's okay to do this in a virtual way. This is the way we have to do it now. It's not ideal, but this is the way we have to do it now. So the other things that they will do is check in with resources that we might have. So it's very interesting to see staff send emails back and around to volunteers and to each other about, here's this resource that we have about educational resources that people could use while they have foster children in their home. Here are things that are happening with food pantries, whatever it might be. They're sharing those kinds of resources to cope with what's going on right now. And that's all happening electronically. The other thing that our supervisors do is, in the case with the volunteers, they'll be checking in, did you make that phone call with that child? So we're doing business as usual, but it's business as usual in a different way. You know, checking in, did you email? Did you attend that child and family team meeting that was held via Zoom? So we're still trying to keep connected with them, whether it's by offering resources that they can pass on, or by connecting with them as a volunteer. The other thing that we do as an agency is we send out a regular volunteer voice newsletter, and I'm happy to forward it on to anybody, that it has a good message of appreciation and encouragement for our volunteers. It has substantive information about, here's some resources that you can have, just keeping them in the loop. You know, this is a weird time for everyone, and we want them to stay in the loop. We have kept them informed from the very beginning on each level of restriction that our community has endured, and how we will continue to do our job for our children. So it's really important to think, as you talk about your existing volunteers, what is our continued message to them? And I said we sent resources to them as well. I think it's important to have a plan and think about how you are going to connect in each part of the pipeline, your existing volunteers, and if you are able to use new volunteers in some way, how is that all going to work? And Mark gave you really good ideas about how to make sure that they're safe and you're safe if it's in person. I think another way that you could use existing volunteers if they can't fulfill your mission right now is hosting, you know, call together a Zoom meeting and host a focus group on your own volunteers. It keeps them connected. You know, you could say, I'd like to have 20 people come, you know, call in on this Zoom meeting, and let's just share your experiences of the best thing that happened when you were a volunteer. I mean, as a volunteer, I would think, oh, that'd be great. I could hear everybody else. That's a really great way to connect with everybody. We're, you know, getting that circle of encouragement and helping you to keep volunteers. You could also ask them to call donors and thank them, or call other volunteers and thank them. We've done that with our board, as many people do, and I think that's a really important piece of keeping volunteers engaged during this time. If you have a group of volunteers that can't do your mission right now in some way. So I hope that my case study, I hope that what I've come up with and what we've come up with at Child Advocates can help you. If there's anything that I can do to answer your questions or send you anything that we have, I'm happy to do that. It is a new world for us all, but I have to say, I think someone said it earlier, I think it's a really good addition to how we do business as not-for-profits, to not say, oh no, we can't do that virtually, but instead to say, how can we do this virtually and how can it support our mission? Because volunteers are there because they want to help you, but they're there for their own purpose as well. And you want to make sure that you're encouraging them and gathering them in as much as you can. So with that, thank you. And I'll answer any questions if anybody has any questions.
That's awesome.
Thank you both. Pardon me, Mark. Before we're going to enter into some question and answer time. I see one's already been posted, but also just so you have this too, you should see a poll pop up in a window here. We are planning on hosting several webinars over different subjects. And so feel free to click on topics or different types of webinars that you'd like to see us grab some resources for moving forward. It looks like we have a question from Sarah to the panelists. How did you notify people there is an online info session being offered, and how do you advertise?
Thank you. I forgot to say that. I was trying to read my notes and I forgot to say that. We did it via our website. So the old way that we did it before was that we would have, you know, some kind of advertisement or some kind of event that would drive people to our website. They would have to register to be on our info session. So we're doing it in the same way.
Are you adopting any other ways to get out in front of people right now, or are you investing more in social media, email, or what are some new ways that you're thinking you're going to get your message out there?
So this is when I would turn to Ty Spisak, who is our Director of Marketing and Communications, and she's fabulous. And so, you know, when this happened, she created a 3-point plan for us to go through, and we've just relied on, you know, what she's devised for us, thinking ahead, you know, thinking ahead what our message would be first, and okay, we're taking care of our children, and this is how we're doing it. Secondly, this is how you could help by volunteer, and third, you know, can we have your support? So I think that way of thinking, when you have something like this happen, will really help you plan what you need to do. So we've been able to do a PSA with the Department of Child Services and our State Office of Guardian Ad Litem CASA, a radio PSA. We're working on a video or TV PSA. You know, just doing all those kinds of things that you would normally get out the word about. The need persists. Even though everybody is staying at home, that does not mean the child abuse stops. In fact, we know that it has actually increased.
That's great. That's great. If there are any other questions, please feel free to submit them via the chat. I'll chime in just for a moment if anybody needs any one-on-one advice or strategy on the conversion technologies to use, or think through some virtual volunteer opportunities, feel free to get in touch with the team here at Selflessly. We're offering just some free office hours to help organizations think through ways that you can engage with people while they're sitting at home right now, and maybe looking for things to do. Some of the examples that we're seeing a lot of as well is think about the projects that you've been putting on hold for a while that you haven't had time to get around to yet. There are skilled people at home right now that what may take you or I quite some time to try to research and figure out how to implement. There may be a potential volunteer at home right now that would take them a quarter of that time that would be willing to lend a hand and help you get that stuff done. So we're seeing a lot of requests for like graphic design, website, content generation, some of these things that, I mean, I'm not running a nonprofit, but as a CEO, the last thing I want to do is write a copy for our website. But those are some things that you may want to even zoom out and look at what operations could be covered by somebody right now, or some of these projects that, that you could maybe farm out to people in this time. So if there aren't any questions, we want to be cognizant of your time so you can get back to your organization. Again, I'd like to thank both Cindy and Mark for their time and your help and lending your brains to help the collective group here. We'll email the slide deck out and also send a link to the recording of this webinar. We'll also post this on virtualgiveback.org to be viewed at a later date. Looks like we have some great ideas for our next webinar, and we'll send a message to let you know when and who's going to be speaking at that one. Again, any questions, virtual give back related? Yes, Brooke, you're welcome to share the PowerPoint. This is very much an open source mantra. So the more we share and involve each other, the better. So please feel free, and if there's anything else we can help with, we're happy to connect. Our email address is hello@selfless.ly, and please join us for the next one. And thank you so much. Thanks, Cindy. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Talk soon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.